Hello guys, good morning. I'm going to get started. And if you're watching on the live stream, hello. Sorry, Joe? Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So this is our inaugural talk. The idea for this session is I am particularly excited about having Dara Horn, who's the author of People Love Dead Jews. She is our speaker, our Yom HaShoah speaker, which the service this year is going to be at Westside Presbyterian Church. And there were two things why I thought, and actually I've been planning this since last April when we booked her. I mean, it was before last Yom HaShoah, but that was too soon to plan it, because this book had just come out. And I thought, how great would it be to have her speak in Ridgewood, because one of the central, because she mentions Ridgewood, New Jersey in the book, in a good way, not as a place of anti-Semitism, thank God, but because she's in a chapter about Barry and Fry. And that's one of her central chapters. And that's the reason why we at Temple Israel alternate the venue of our interfaith Holocaust Memorial Service between Temple Israel and Westside Presbyterian Church, because Westside Presbyterian Church was Barry and Fry's church. And he was he's the first American to be recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile, and facilitated the saving of many Jews in the time of the Shoah. And she mentions there's a street named after Barry and Fry in Jerusalem, and a street named after him in Ridgewood. And there's one in Berlin also. And in Marseille. Okay. Yeah, I don't think she knew about all of them. But one of them is here. It's the street right in front of Westside Presbyterian Church, the Barry and Fry way. So that was the reason, and the connection, and I think it'll be meaningful for her to speak at Ridgewood also. When the book, come out was right after we had a slew of terrible anti-Semitic events. We're talking about the Pittsburgh shooting and Poway and Jersey City, and she ended up being one of the top columnist voices in the American media that would write about it from a Jewish perspective. And she said, she's spoken about this, she said it was never a position she interviewed for or sought, but she became one of the voices of sort of Jewish responses when there's been terrible acts of anti-Semitism, which is how, and she said, I heard, if you didn't see, at the time, a major article, columns published by the New York Times and other, the top media places. So, and her essays are fantastic. She's written 3 novels. She's from New Jersey. She lives not far from here. But this is a collection of essays. And I picked a selection of the topics of chapters from the book to focus on for this series. And the one I picked for today was to start by talking about Anne Frank, because her first chapter is about Anne Frank. And talks about that was sort of the genesis for the whole idea, that she had been asked by Smithsonian magazine or journal to write an article about Anne Frank, and she didn't want to write the article, and was hesitant to do it, and didn't want, and had very ambivalent feelings about Anne Frank, and then she decided that maybe then that's why, right, we should, if something makes us uncomfortable, then we should engage that and think, what is it about the story that makes us uncomfortable? And also because of an incident that had that was in the news then in 2017 and 2018. So I want to read you just the very beginning of her section, and then I'm going to talk a bit about Anne Frank also. I don't necessarily agree with all of the conclusions and the take that she has. One of the things that makes the book a good read and her a good essay writer is you're not going to agree with everything she says. But here's, so the chapter's called, it's the first chapter, and again, it's not a big investment to read this book, either in the actual cost of it, but also in terms of the pages, right? It's not that long. And she's a very good, very, very good writer. So I'll give you a sense of this here. The chapter's called Everyone's Second, in parentheses, Favorite Dead Jew. Right? The first, she doesn't mention, the favorite dead Jew is supposed to be Jesus. So she doesn't mention that, but that's kind of like in the background, right? And then, so the second favorite dead Jew is Anne Frank. She says, people love dead Jews. Living Jews, not so much. This disturbing idea was suggested by an incident in 2018 at the Anne Frank House, the blockbuster Amsterdam museum built out of Frank's secret annex, or in Dutch, het achterhuis, the house behind. A series of tiny hidden rooms where the teenage Jewish diarist lived with her parents, her sister, and 4 other persecuted Jews for over 2 years, about 2.5 years, before being captured by Nazis and deported to Auschwitz in 1944. Here's how much people love dead Jews. Anne Frank's diary, first published in Dutch in 1947 by her surviving father, Otto Frank, has been translated into 70 languages and has sold more than 30 million copies worldwide. And the Anne Frank House now hosts well over 1 million visitors each year, with reserved tickets selling out months in advance. But when a Okay, at least I got the mic back on. So there may be a way to do that, but I don't know how to figure that out, man. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I'm going to speak here. So again, I need to speak in the mic so the people watching on live stream are able to hear. So I was reading from this opening section. So it says the Anne Frank reserved tickets selling out months in advance. Okay. It went out here too, so I don't know that it's a battery issue. But yeah. But when a young employee at the Anne Frank House tried to wear his yarmulke to work, his employers told him to hide it under a baseball cap. All right, so this was this incident that she's talking about that happened in 2018. The museum's goal, I'm reading from Dara, was neutrality, one person explained to the British newspaper the Daily Mail, and a live Jew in a yarmulke might interfere with the museum's, quote, independent position. The museum finally relented after deliberating for 4 months, which seems like a rather long time for the Anne Frank House to ponder whether it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. So that's the way she writes, right? Very, very biting. I'll just continue. I just want to finish her opening section, and then we'll talk about it a bit. One could call this a simple mistake, except that it echoed a similar incident the previous year when visitors noticed a discrepancy in the museum's audio guide displays. Each audio guide language was represented by a national flag, with the exception of Hebrew, which was represented only by the language's name in its alphabet. The display was eventually corrected to include the Israeli flag. These public relations mishaps, clumsy though they may have been, were not really mistakes, nor were they even the fault of the museum alone. On the contrary, these instances of concealed Jewish identity are the key to the runaway success of Anne Frank's diary and fame. This sort of hiding was an essential part of the diary's original publication, in which several direct references to Jewish practice were edited away. They were put back in now. They were also part of the psychological legacy of Anne Frank's parents and grandparents, German Jews for whom the price of admission to Western society was assimilation, hiding their differences by accommodating and ingratiating themselves to the culture that ultimately sought to destroy them. That price lies at the heart of Anne Frank's endless appeal. After all, Anne Frank had to hide her identity so much that she was forced to spend 2 years in a closet rather than breathe in public. And that closet, hiding place for a dead Jewish girl, is what millions of visitors want to see. So that's her opening section, the beginning of the book. And you could see then that that's why she's uncomfortable about writing of Anne Frank, and that, comes across right, the very next line she writes. She says, "Surely there's nothing left to say about Anne Frank, except that there is everything left to say about her, all the books she never lived to write." Because it's not, right, she's a promising author. And then what she goes on to say in the article is that would Anne Frank be so popular if she had survived the Holocaust, right? Or is it the fact that she's dead, right? And that it's that makes it different. And she talks about other memoirs of people that had survived did not reach the same fame. The only one that did is Elie Wiesel's Night, and she has an interesting talk where she compares that, and talks about that as sort of almost like a sequel to the Diary of a Young Girl, and then what happens when you're at the camp and how you deal with that. And also the importance in Wiesel's treatment that he has to universalize it. And that's what people love about Anne Frank's story, that it's universalized, which is the key part, right? The sinker in her paper, and I read, this is then in page 9, says most often quoted from Frank's diary are her famous words, "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart." That's the most famous line from Anne Frank. And then she writes, "Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart before meeting people who weren't. 3 weeks after writing those words, she met the people who weren't." Right? 3 weeks later, the SS come and they get arrested. So again, we focus on that optimism, on that universalism, but then 3 weeks later she's arrested. So I want to talk, use this opportunity just to talk about Anne Frank and Anne Frank's role in dealing with the Holocaust legacy and anti-Semitism in America, not necessarily Dara Horn's take on Anne Frank, but again, using this just to, it's the most recent, and got a lot of readership, and what Dara Horn says is worth considering. How many of you have been to the Anne Frank house? Yeah, a lot of you. How many of you have read Anne Frank? Look at that, right? And most of you read it in school, right? Or later, okay. I mean, it is many people are assigned Anne Frank in either middle school or high school, right? It's just, the book is a standard book that's on curricula lists for English classes or a special Holocaust unit. And sometimes you have it, when I was in middle school, I ended up didn't read Anne Frank because they gave us a few options to read, and I figured, well, everyone that reads Anne Frank would read something else. So then I didn't, I did read through it carefully before today, but I had not read through it before, and probably had similar, ambivalent feelings about it as what Dara Horn expressed. But it's had a specifically tremendous influence in the United States. Because of the felicity of the English version. Obviously, she wrote originally in Dutch with a little German spattered here and there, but because of its use in schools and in popular culture, right, through plays, through movies, and then going to the Anne Frank house. It is one of the top things to see when you're in Amsterdam. And Al and I went when we visited Amsterdam a number of years ago. You need to reserve your ticket. Even with the reserves, there's always a long line, and it is very moving, right, to see the house, and you see the secret annex where they hid for 2.5 years until, they were discovered in August of 1944 when they're discovered and arrested. There are moments of the book, a few passages that I want to share that are just extraordinary and get us, just get a sense, a little bit of Anne Frank's writings. It's been a while since a lot of us have read it. And I'll just share with you a few that came to mind. One is towards the beginning. "I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old girl. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. I feel like writing, and I have an even greater need to get all kinds of things off my chest. Paper has more patience than people." So she's a very, very thoughtful, young person, wise ahead of her years. And is right, and then she goes over it a second time, because in early 1944 they hear address on the radio from the Dutch government in exile that they want to collect memoirs, diaries, so that when the war ends, to document the experience of those Dutch resistance people, who were still in German-occupied Holland. So she realizes, oh wait, maybe my diary will be of interest. So then she goes back and she edits it herself. And as a 14-year-old, as a 15-year-old, she's just June, July, August. She's 2 months. She's 15 and 2 months when she gets arrested. So so she's going back. She starts the diary when she's 13, and then she goes back when she's 14 and 15, and keeps polishing it up, and really worked hard on it. And that sense of paper is more, but it's the idea of paper being more patience than people, that the diary is a mixture, right? There is parts of it that talk about the war and about how they're hiding and the ordeals. And there are other parts that talk about her being frustrated with her parents, and she can't stand her mother, and she's remembering this boyfriend, but then she starts, flirting with the boy upstairs who's in their group of tiny world of 8 people. So in a sense, at first, you're living, and this other, the 15-year-old boy is living up the steps from you and the only person you have to talk to, but also just a budding romance, a teenage romance. So it's both the most unusual and also the most normal thing that's happening at the same time. And that's part of the thing that makes it so powerful in the way that she tells the story. Do any of you remember, it was about 12 years ago when I had invited Jack and Ina Pollock to speak here? You remember. They were former members, they're both deceased now. They were in their 90s when I invited them here. Were from my former congregation in Scarsdale. And they were both survivors from Amsterdam. And they published a series of letters. They preserved these letters that they wrote back and forth to each other when they were in the concentration camp in Westerbork, where the Dutch Jews were originally taken. And they had an affair in the camps. And they were both unhappily, he was unhappily married, is already estranged, but his wife was in the same barracks as his future wife was. It was a very complicated soap opera. And they wrote letters that were then smuggled into the barrack at the camp, and eventually after the war they found each other, and then he divorced his first wife and they got married, and they lived and ended up being married for over 60 years and lived in Eastchester, and he was knighted by Queen Beatrice of the Netherlands, and his job was an accountant. His secretary said certified Dutch public accountant. So it's not just like a CPDA or a C, whatever it is. And but they would speak in schools and places all over the time of their experience, and he spoke here. And what's so moving about their story is that he said, okay, it wasn't limited the affair, but they basically had a love affair while he was married to someone else, which isn't that kosher. But the point is, life goes on, even in a concentration camp, and we were, and don't think of people as, just as victims, that we were alive, and we built a life again, and they had children, they built a home here, only 45 minutes away from where we are now. They both died quickly, one after the other, not long after they both spoke here. So I'm so glad we were able to, have them here. And their book is published. We have it in a library upstairs. Steal a Pencil for Me. Exactly. That's the book. Steal a Pencil for Me. And there was a documentary made about them when the book came out. I think we might have the DVD of it there. If anyone's interested, I can get it to you. He was very involved with the Anne Frank Foundation, was very supportive of it financially on their board. And it's sort of the Anne Frank story, but the not Anne Frank story, because this is the story of the survivors that's never as famous as the ones who died, which is part of the point that Dara Horn is trying to say. But it's the same argument, too, that we have to focus on the life force, the everyday things that are able to survive in the midst of circumstances that we can't possibly imagine. In that sense, there's a similarity there. And that's one of the things that makes Anne Frank's diary so powerful. Okay. This is one. She had a real love of appreciation for nature, which she even admits at one point. She said, I might not have felt the same if I could go on walks outside. But every time you had peek out the window. You'd imagine that. She writes, I see the 8 of us in the annex as if we were a patch of blue sky surrounded by menacing black clouds. The perfectly round spot on which we're standing is still safe, but the clouds are moving in on us, and the ring between us and the approaching danger is being pulled tighter and tighter. We're surrounded by darkness and danger. In our desperate search for a way out, we keep bumping into each other. We look at the fighting down below and the peace and beauty up above. In the meantime, we've been cut off by the dark mass of clouds so that we can go neither up nor down. It looms before us like an impenetrable wall, trying to crush us, but not yet able to. I can only cry out and implore, oh, ring, ring, open wide and let us out. It's good. It's good writing for a 14-year-old. You know, one of the things that Dara Horn does, I'm not going to read this section, is she offers a hypothetical obituary of Anne Frank if she lived to be 96 years old, and then imagining what her life as a writer would have been like as a journalist and a writer, which is what she wanted to be. No, she would not have been as famous as she was, being discovered as the diary of a girl who did not survive. So, let's see what this section is. She has this long section about her fountain pen and how much she loved her pen, which is beautiful. And also at one point it's a demise where it gets accidentally put into the fire and burns, and then they discover it there. And then there's, in the middle of this, and she tells it in a very humorous way, the story. But this is a way about how things speak to us in a way that she never intended. She writes, you know, they find the clip of it as they're looking in the stove, and it showed that it must have melted into stone, Father conjectured, like they found that it was put in the furnace. So she writes, I'm left with one consolation, small though it may be. My fountain pen was cremated, just as I would like to be someday. That's like, what do you do with a sentence like that? Okay. She wants to be cremated one day the same way why people choose to be cremated today, because she doesn't want to be buried. She probably was cremated, crematoria, right? Others say the body was probably might have put into a mass grave, so we don't know, you know. But she writes that with just a sense of innocence, but the point was that the pen it ended its days and was burned. So it's, again, there's things like that we can take out of context, and it's impossible for us not to read them out of context. You know, we have passages like that. Here's a few more. You know, she talks about which of the people here would most suspect that so much is going on in the mind of a teenage girl? You know, and her father said that after it was discovered, right? That the people or the helpers then came back to the house, discovered the diaries, and then gave it to Otto Frank once it was determined that she had not survived, because otherwise it was in a locked diary. So no one wanted to invade her privacy, and then when they knew she was dead, and that was different, they gave it to Otto Frank. He read it, he couldn't believe that his daughter had all these thoughts and that she just kept all inside because she didn't express herself that way to anyone else, and then debated what to do. And finally in 1947 he published them. And he published them, he edited. He took out all the many parts, right? Part of the parts was the stuff that was more Jewish, took out those parts. He took out the parts that talked about her feelings about sexuality, her descriptions about anatomy, took out also when she criticizes her mother often, when she speaks, you know, understanding perhaps truthfully about how her parents' marriage was not a good marriage. So all of that he edited out after he died. Then the foundation that he willed it to, then put the stuff back in. So we have the full, you know, version that's been studied. But that's sort of the history there. But it's what she said. She said no one would have imagined, and her father confirmed that. He said never imagined that she was thinking this much. And then, so in March 1944, she writes Kitty. So Kitty was the name she gave her diary. Gave it a name. And she says, Kitty, Anne is crazy, but then these are crazy times and even crazier circumstances. The nicest part is being able to write down all of my thoughts and feelings. Otherwise, I'd absolutely suffocate. And that sense of using writing, right, as a form of therapy, of health, right, is she understood that, which is extraordinary. And she was right. Yeah. I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death. And that's why I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and express all that's inside me. Will I ever be able to write? That's a big question, though, whether will I ever be able to write something great? Because she understands she's writing things that are funny, in the stories, and they're fighting after the cat, and then the cat tries to pee at a different spot in the top of the attic, and then the cat's pee walks down. She says, cat is very, very bad smell, and then it fell into the soup, and she talks about all these things that they had to deal with. And she goes back and forth, right, between those mundane, normal things and then understanding the world around. One day this terrible war will be over, the time will come and we'll be people again and not just Jews. See, that's right, because she knows that because she's not accepted as a person. The diary starts before they go into the annex. So the very, very first few pages talks about just being a 12-year-old girl in school and getting her report card and hanging out with her friends, and the boys are after her but they're too old, and then it's right at the beginning. So you get a sense of real regular life, and then the separation from regular life and the understanding of the Jewishness as a divider there. There's a section that and I don't know that I kept the I didn't mark it out here, where she talks about getting Christmas presents and Hanukkah presents. And it reminded me, it would have been good to read the last time we were here a couple of weeks ago, meeting with Reverend Paulsma about the December dilemma with Christmas and Hanukkah. She says her father gave her, they were getting books, and gave her a copy of the New Testament, because she didn't know anything about that. And then she said it was my Hanukkah present, but maybe I should say that's my Christmas present, because Jesus and Hanukkah don't really go together. So, which was a great remark that she had there. And they celebrated Christmas, and she said they celebrated Christmas more in the annex than they did earlier. And because I guess their helpers, the people that were helping them, gave them Christmas presents. But Hanukkah is the only real Jewish observance that she mentioned. There's no mention of anything else. But there is a Jewish identity. And when she says that she wants to be a writer, she says her sister, Margaret, who also died, wanted to move to Palestine. Which, what is she mentioning, and what's really going on behind that? I mean, Dara Horn writes about that also. You have to imagine, how would she write thinking about the adults, right? She's complaining about the adults are always criticizing her. But what is it looking from the adults' perspective? How are they living, two married couples and another single man and three teenagers with no privacy, right? And all living together. So we try to piece together their story based on her tidbits. So she mentions, my sister wants to be a nurse in Palestine. Well, that means that maybe they talked about Zionism, right? And maybe they talked about that the Jews need to leave. And they're not Dutch Jews, they're German Jews who moved to Holland escaping the Nazis. She does have a section where she talks about whether they'll be allowed to stay in Holland after the war, and that there is a growing anti-Semitism. She sort of understands that even when the war is over, many of the Dutch are not going to want us to stay. They let us stay here because we're escaping the Nazis, and once the Nazis are gone, they're going to want us to go back to Germany. And she talks at the beginning that yet they've made their distinction with Germany. She says we're not allowed to speak German because it's only allowed to speak the language of civilized peoples. But yet, she puts in, whenever she gets excited, she puts in a phrase in German, and then it's like they keep it in German and translate it to make the point it's not in Dutch. And they listen to she mentions they listen to a radio program of the German masters. So the culture is still there. It's very, very complicated. She writes here, sometimes I seriously doubt whether anyone will be interested in any of this drivel, which of course we still are all these years later. And then this is a great section on the war. She says, I don't believe the war is simply the work of politicians and capitalists. Oh no, the common man is every bit as guilty. Otherwise people and nations would have rebelled long ago. there's a destructive urge in people. The urge to rage, murder, and kill, until all of humanity, without exception, undergoes a metamorphosis. Wars will continue to be waged, and everyone that has been carefully built up, cultivated and grown, will be cut down and destroyed, only to start all over again. So there's a realism there, and that goes against the passage, oh, I still believe that people are decent. You know, you take that out of context. You read it in context, there's a lot more there. And she goes back and forth, and she says, I'm a moody teenager. She says, so my moods. And it doesn't only reflect how she feels about her mother. She's actually very consistent in not liking her mother. But it goes back and forth in terms of her optimism and pessimism about the world outside. And she talks about the debates they have and the arguments over when the invasion's going to be. It's a great passage when D-Day comes. She says, the annex decided it was just a phony, was fake news, and then of course it was real. And for the last 7 months, they're debating when is it going to happen. Okay. But I'm going to put this all in my book. She says, after the war, I'd like to publish a book called The Secret Annex. It remains to be seen whether I'll succeed, but my diary can serve as the basis. And then now it's that Dutch anti-Semitism. So this is May 22nd, 1944. She writes, anti-Semitism has cropped up in circles where once it would have been unthinkable. How does she even know? She's living in the annex. Well, they're talking every day with the office workers who are secretly helping them. They're listening to the radio, the German radio, the British, the BBC. So they have all these different, they do have source of information that they get and are understanding that anti-Semitism is there. I have only one hope, that this anti-Semitism is just a passing thing, that the Dutch will show their true colors, that they'll never waver from what they know in their hearts to be just, for this is unjust. Here's a passage about a religion, which I thought was very, very powerful. And this is from a perspective who's basically being brought up as a secular Jew, right? Except they do Hanukkah presents, they also do Christmas presents. There's nothing other specifically Jewish. She knows the Hebrew Bible better than the New Testament. Her father gave her the New Testament not to make her Christian, but to add to her education, because her father took her education seriously, even though she doesn't fully appreciate it. And while Dara Horn takes her family to task as, oh, well, this is the German assimilating Jews, they're already hiding, they're already embarrassed of their Jewishness. I thought that was a cheap shot against German Jews, and I wouldn't have said that, right? But this is what Anne Frank says in her own words. People who are religious should be glad, since not everyone is blessed with the ability to believe in a higher order. You don't even have to live in fear of eternal punishment. The concepts of purgatory, heaven, and hell are difficult for many people to accept. Yet religion itself, any religion, keeps a person on the right path. Not the fear of God, but upholding your own sense of honor and obeying your own conscience. How noble and good everyone could be if at the end of each day they were to review their own behavior and weigh up the rights and wrongs. They would automatically try to do better at the start of each new day, and after a while would certainly accomplish a great deal. Everyone is welcome to this prescription. It costs nothing and is definitely useful. Those who don't know will have to find out by experience that a quiet conscience gives you strength. I think that's an extraordinary passage, right? She says that religion is not about theological doctrine of purgatory and heaven and hell. It's not about fear of God. It's about living up to a conscience, right? And holding ideal up for yourself and having it guide your life. That's extraordinary, and that's not something to be dismissed as musings of a 14-year-old secular Jew. I think that's rather sophisticated. And then this is the key section. I'll give you the whole paragraph, the one that when she says, I believe people are truly good at heart. The whole paragraph is like this. Anyone who claims that the older folks have a more difficult time in the annex doesn't realize that the problems have a far greater impact upon us, meaning the teenagers. We're much too young to deal with these problems, but they keep thrusting themselves on us until finally we're forced to think up a solution, though most of the time our solutions crumble when faced with the facts. It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. That's the full passage. And it goes into context with her musings on religion also. Right? So there's in her understanding there. So those are just some selections that I chose from the book. I would like to disagree with Dara Horn and think that Anne's diary would be just as successful if she had survived. I don't know that. I want to be more optimistic and less pessimistic about it. But Dara Horn's point is that what makes Anne Frank why especially is such an influence, especially on Americans, and not only American Jews, but Americans in general, is because they like the idea of a Jew who has to hide, a Jew who's not there out in the open, and a Jew who's died. And that's why in the title she has that reference to Jesus there, and she just lets that hang there. Because there's the sense that there's, we outsiders, we mean Americans, not we as Jews, right? People who suffer, we like that. Jews who died. Oh, okay. So I don't want to deal with living Jews, I want to deal with dead Jews. And she argues that that's the inherent, that deeper anti-Semitism that still exists under the surface and sometimes not so far under the surface in America, the same way that it did. And that's part of the real confrontation with the legacy of the Holocaust that's so important when we recognize that. When I always, when I teach the Holocaust, and the reason why we have to have this thing at 11:30 and not 10:30 is because I teach a history of the Holocaust course in BCHSJS with our own teenagers at 10:30. So what I try to get across is that the story of the Holocaust is not like a story of and I try to discuss this, we did last year, the whole series of anti-Semitism, is very, very different from the attacks against Jews in the Middle Ages. Right? The Holocaust happens in modern Europe. It's happened today. And we shouldn't feel that the distance that we have, the distance between us and the Holocaust in historical terms is nothing. Right? And the Nazis came to power in a democratic republic. Obviously, there are differences between the German Republic and the United States, but it's still democracy. Right? And then it spreads, and even Anne recognized that in the Netherlands there was anti-Semitism. And there were Dutch people who were helping them, but there were also Dutch people who were informing on Jews. And they got a reward from the SS for turning Jews in. And that's why she lived every day in constant fear. Every time they heard a noise, her heart would start pounding, because they knew there were people around them who hated them, and that fear, that hatred, and that prejudice was underground in a modern country. And that's why Dara Horn's story about 2017 or 18, that the Anne Frank house didn't want to allow one of their employees to wear a kippah, right? So it's the same issue, right? That there's still this underlying prejudice there. When there was an attack against a synagogue in Holland, Germany, a few years ago. It was a shooting attack there. There was a demonstration, an anti-Semitism demonstration throughout Germany of people walking around all day wearing a kippah. So in a sense, and they had the newspapers even had a cutout kippah. They would cut this around like a circle and staple it here, so you can make your own kippah and wear it. And there was one day where everyone was wearing kippot, so the Jews would be accepted and not have to hide Judaism. Again, not that living in the modern world, not that the answer is Jews setting themselves apart. Right? And that's part of the whole debate about anti-Semitism, whether we have to stand ourselves apart, right? Whether we should put all our eggs in Israel, whether we should put all our eggs in traditional living and observance. She has this section at the end where she talks about Talmud study and Daf Yomi, and that's sort of the solution. She says at the beginning, when she gives talks, she always says, who can name 4 concentration camps? And almost everyone can. And then when she says, who can name 4 Yiddish writers? And nobody can name even, hopefully people can name 1, but not more than that. So her point is where is our acceptance of Jewish life, right, beyond the death? But there is the flip side. There is an understanding. So in the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, it was designed, it was supposed to originally been a Holocaust museum. And that's what she's criticizing in her approach, that why is everyone so gung-ho about marking and remembering the suffering and the dying of Jews and not Jewish living? But they understood that. So when the original idea was that New York City needs a Holocaust museum, but instead it's called the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And it's basically 3 floors. The middle floor is the Holocaust history, and that was what the funding was for. But the first floor is Jewish life before the Holocaust. The second life is Jewish life in America after the Holocaust. So you can't live without the story of the suffering, but we also have to focus on the living, right, and the positive stuff around that. And that's where I think, why the role of Anne Frank and why it's so important. Right? Because she is, through her words, able to talk about life moving through the same way that Jack and Nina Pollock did in Steal a Pencil for me. And the fact that she didn't survive doesn't change the story of how she did survive up until the point that she didn't. And that they did live for 2.5 years and managed to continue their lives. The other thing, thought about it, this has nothing to do, this is sort of an aside, one way to understand Anne Frank, separate from the Holocaust history, is something that today I think we can understand it more than than ever before. Not just because of our concerns of rising anti-Semitism here, but we've just gone through a period of about 1.5 years where we lock kids up at home. Right? And kids had to basically get through their subjects on their own, right, in their rooms, and didn't have classrooms where they were able to be in contact with their contemporaries, and had to miss a portion of their development of their lives in isolation. Now, obviously, living through COVID and pandemic was much better than Anne's experience in the secret annex. In that we had Zoom, right? We can go outside, right? We were able to engage with nature, at least in the backyard. At the beginning, though, remember they closed the bike path and we weren't allowed to go, parks were closed off. But there was still that sense of living in isolation. And that's one of the themes she writes through the book, right? Of that they had to do all their, teach themselves. So they would get their textbook, and she still worked through her algebra textbook. And her father was trying to teach her Latin. And they were, and working on Dutch and going through the subjects that they had to just work with on their own and just use the textbooks and use the people around them, but not being able to have in class. And the one thing she says after D-Day happens, the one thing she's most excited about, and her sister, Margaret, is excited about, is D-Day happens in June. They're saying maybe by October we can go back to school. Right? And they can't wait to go back to school. Can't wait to meet with other contemporaries. And Anne even starts to get frustrated with the boyfriend upstairs. Says, okay, he's a nice guy, but it was the only choice she had. She wanted to go back to school. She knows he's not perfect. So part of that also is that sense of how we experience living in an environment where we're separated from the world. So I wonder if, and I want to talk with people who are, educators who teach Anne Frank in middle school and high school today, is how you read Anne Frank post-COVID, given the experience of the pandemic isolation. And if that might give, especially teenagers, right, a different understanding of the life, because that's what we want to do. With everything we do in Holocaust education, any type of education, is we want to be able to transmit the perspective of what we're learning, right? How can we see things through her eyes? How can we understand something from someone else's perspective? That's ultimately what everything try to do in education is about. And we have an opportunity today to do that, that we've never had before. And the ultimate purpose, right, of Holocaust education, of putting anti-Semitism as a topic that needs to be addressed in schools, is how do we get kids to understand the implications of prejudice? How do we get kids to understand what it means to be singled out, to be persecuted? And how do we get people to understand what the dangers are, of these things? And this is a way, this is an opportunity to do that today. We often say, it's Holocaust education is so much harder now because the survivors are gone, right? And we mostly, and we don't have, so Jack Pollock is spending, he must have gone to hundreds and hundreds of schools and given the same talk that he gave here at Temple Israel. He's gone now. His wife Ina is gone now. And there's no survivors are able to do that anymore. There are few left, rarely. So how do we find a way to tell the story? And the answer is to be careful. And that's why Dara Horn's warnings are important, right? We don't want to just universalize it. We don't want to make it so Christian, like, oh, she's a martyr, and that's her reference to Jesus, our second favorite, everyone's second favorite dead Jew. Oh, this person that dies, it's the suffering, let's read about someone else's suffering, and what are the universal messages from it. So we want to be mindful not just to read the story that way, but to find a way to read the story that it gets people to understand what the experience is. And I wouldn't be so quick to chuck Anne Frank. I think there's a reason why so many people want to go see where she lived, and so many people read the book, and it's not just because of that. Brian. Right. The argument, just for those who didn't hear, right, is that one of the things that makes Anne Frank's story so powerful is that she's not a traditional Jew. She's basically an assimilated Jewish family. She's a Western Jew, not so dissimilar from us and our experience. So it makes it more relatable in that sense, right? In that she's not, right, her subjects are, she likes Greek mythology. That's her favorite subject. She doesn't like math. That's hard. So those are the issues that, the same, right? She's not talking about, other very more specific issues that would apply in other enclave Jewish experiences. And it makes it powerful. And it also raises that challenge, right? And that's the challenge that Dara Horn raises, right? We have to be careful, right, to not put ourselves in hiding when we don't need to, and be comfortable with who we are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we're fast forward 40 years. Many of our children are engaged, but certainly not as engaged as we were. They look at the
Right, the question is how do we re-engage, right, when people don't feel the same connection as when you growing up in the 50s and 60s, right, in the real wake of the Shoah. So that's where it is an educational challenge, right? I find so attendance at Yom HaShoah observances decreases dramatically year by year, right? Because it used to be like one of the things you went to in the year, right? So that the centrality of the Holocaust in terms of American Jewish identity is not, it's not the identity beacon that it used to be when I grew up as well, only slightly after you. So, and that's a challenge. It's also an opportunity, right? Because it's true, and Dara Horn and others would point out that we should have a positive Jewish identity that's based on things that we love about Jewish living, not just about dead Jews. That's true. But we also need to not lose our connection and the memory, right, of the trauma. And we can learn from it, things we can learn from it, but we can't allow time to pass. And throughout the whole arc of Jewish history, there's so much in being able to, how do we keep these moments and experiences with us to keep them fresh? And it's not just through our rituals of the Yom HaShoah service, it's ultimately through, I think what I was talking about before, I would say, which is how do we keep that perspective for us? And I think that's why books like Anne Frank are so important, right? And we should think about how to teach them in new ways, right? And how to connect them, because because, as I said before, because we don't have the survivors, there are so few left. And there won't be more in another 5 years, right? Who can come and actually talk to students. I mean, my son, who went to a Jewish high school, they did have a survivor come, a very old person who was still somehow filled with energy and was able to tell a story to kids. We had that, we did a tour, Germany tour, I don't know if it was this one or it was my prior, it was a prior congregation, where, it was my prior congregation where a man came and he brought his father, and his father was a survivor from Dachau. It was our group. You remember that, right? Yes. Oh, we went to Dachau, and he was telling his story, and he was remembering where each building was. And our guide got all pissed off, remember, and because no one was listening to him. And it's one of those things, like, you look back in life, like, I wish I could roll back the clock, because if I could, I would have fired the guide right at that moment. Because it was, I mean, yes, first of all, we were speaking with someone who was with us, who was remembering walking there when it was the camp, and it was an opportunity that none of us will ever have an opportunity again, to be in Dachau and walk through the walls of someone who was there for the first time 70 years after he'd been there before. So those opportunities are not going to be around much longer, and they're very, very fleeting now. So the way that then we remember is through literature. Right, is through words, because and that's why that section that she says is so important when she says, "Well, I'll live forever through writing," and that when people work, through creation of art, if it's writing, if it's plastic arts, if it's whatever media that they use, there's always this consciousness, and she had the consciousness of herself as an artist, even though very young, that we're